what I want to do is talk instead a little bit about some of the economics of teacher quality. And this will skirt any legal issues for the most part and just talk about what we know about the value of excellent teachers. And so I'm going to underscore that. Now, the one part that I will do to talk about California, and I'm working hard to stay away from California. California is, in fact, the basket case of the United States. And so, if pressed, I will give you detail on that. But what I wanted to give you is just some idea of the challenges facing us. Now, I don't know if anybody can read this. What this is a ranking of every state in the United States against all of the countries that took the international PISA tests. So you start at the far left, all the lines in blue are separate countries, and the red lines are states. And you start with Shanghai, which isn't really a country, but then you get to Singapore and Hong Kong and Korea and Finland on the top there. And if you look hard enough, you see California, which has just edged out Greece, which is not what I think California should be challenging, is Greece. It ranks somewhere behind Lithuania and a few other places. So that's my Vergara as the buildup of California has special problems independent of the constitutionality of 5 challenged statutes. Now, this is also about equity, and so I'm going to throw up a number here at the beginning to talk about equity, and we'll come back to it, we'll circle back to this. But I've been arguing, as Jeff said in the introduction, that performance of students is a harbinger of what the economics of a nation will look like in the future. In the long run, the only thing that matters for long-run well-being of a nation is the skills of its population. And this slide just tried to put that in a little bit of perspective. What in behind this is, with a co-author, we've looked at how economic growth is affected by achievement, and if you play through a scenario where you get all students up to NCLB standards, but this is 2014, so it's a good time to talk about NCLB standards. If all students got to NCLB standards in the next 20 years, and we projected out what that would mean for the U.S. economy, it has a present value of $86 trillion. Now, nobody in this room knows what $1 trillion is, including myself, but the total GDP of the U.S. is $16.5 trillion now. So we're talking about something that is, if we knew how to do the multiplication, maybe 5 times current GDP in the same kind of dollars. And it's present value because things way in the future don't affect me at all, so I tend to discount those down, and it weights things in the current. But compared, that looks like a 12% increase in GDP each and every year for the next 80 years, which translates into a 24% increase in the average paycheck of each and every worker in the U.S. over the next 80 years. So we're talking about serious matters, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And then so let me talk about what can be done, and here is my answer. First is somebody else talked about, we could improve teacher quality. Second, we could also improve teacher quality, and you obviously know the third here is that we could improve teacher quality. The research suggests that essentially the only thing that matters is the quality of the teachers in terms of what goes on in the schools. Now, there's lots of other things that we talked about last time, about poverty and families and neighborhoods and all these other things that are really important, and we know that they're really, really important. But many of those things we can't affect with public policy very easily. And so we ask our schools to try to do what they can to improve the lives of kids, like bring everybody up to minimal proficient standards by NCLB purposes. So let me talk a little bit about the value of effective teachers. We have lots of research, and it's pretty consistent, that tells us how much difference is there between highly effective teachers and highly ineffective teachers. We know it in terms of what the impact is on students. And it's quite consistent data, and I'm going to just take that information from past research. It has to do with estimating the value added of teachers to separate out teacher effects from all the other influences, and we know about the distribution effect. We also know from a lot of work that my tribe, Economists, does, to look at the value of achievement in skills to individuals in the labor market. It turns out people with more skills earn more money. Okay? That's why lots of people, in fact, go to Columbia University, because they want to get more skills and earn more money. All I'm going to do is try to link those things together, of how much impact a teacher has on the achievement and skills of a child, and then how much that is likely to have on future incomes, and to calculate that, put it all together. So what I'm going to do here is actually two things. One is I'm going to look at the value on the kids in the classroom, the individual kids. And secondly, I'm going to come back to look at the question I introduced before, of what's the impact on the total nation and the aggregate GDP of effective teachers. So these are two different ways to try to put a value on having effective teachers. So there are a lot of alternative approaches to get there. Local actions, legislation, and the courts. I'm not even going to talk about those for the most part until you ask me any questions, or Jeff has asked me on his time. I'm going to ignore that about what's the specific way to get there. The one thing I'll say at the beginning to preclude the first question that always comes, I am not saying that we should rate all teachers by the test scores of their students and give them pay on the test scores of their students. I'm not saying that. And I have never said that. But that's the first answer to the first question, which came from over there, I think. Okay, so here's a picture that I hope you can see. As I said, we know a lot about the distribution of teachers and their impact on students. So what I've done is plot out the value in terms of the future incomes of students, again in present value terms, they're all discounted back to the current time, of having a teacher who's in the 75th percentile, quite a good teacher, right? And one thing that's apparent is that the more teachers that more students that this teacher teaches, the bigger the impact, just because there's more kids in the class. Okay, so that's why this line slopes up. It starts, if there were no kids in the class, there would be 0. And these are comparisons to an average teacher. So this is a 75th percentile teacher compared to an average teacher. And what you see is if this teacher has 30 kids, this is the most sensitive thing, the zombies can't control the machine. The present value annually of a 75th percentile teacher, according to all of the data we have on labor markets and effectiveness, is $430,000 annually. And that's just the increase in achievement that this teacher has on the kids in the class, and what that increase in achievement means, according to history, on the earnings of the people. So we can plot that out in 90th percentile teachers are up approaching $1 million more in terms of generating incomes than an average teacher. But a 60th percentile teacher, a little bit above average, still produces $150,000 more with a class of 30. And it's less if the teacher has fewer students. Now, the obvious thing from this, you know the next answer, right? There's also the people on the other side of the average teacher. So here's the 40th percentile, the 25th percentile, the 10th percentile teacher. One way of looking at the issues of what has become highly ineffective teachers, which is a term of art that relates to lawyers, is that this 10th percentile teacher is subtracting $800,000 in future income of her students each and every year she's in the classroom compared to an average teacher. Okay. So that's one argument that I would make, that paying attention to the effectiveness of teachers makes sense because it has real implications for students in their future lives. This is all real empirical data that we're putting together. Okay, so one approach that economists talk about that always brings the second question, I think it's over here, is, well, maybe you ought to provide incentives to keep the best teachers in the classroom, and which would be aligning pay with performance of teachers. That obviously requires a sensible evaluation system, which we are only starting to get in any states now, but in general we haven't had. And it requires rewarding success. And I posit it also amounts to contemplating the zero pay option for the 10th percentile teachers that are costing his or her students $800,000 a year. Now, I want to play out the zero option for a minute, because this has a way of waking you all up if you've been around for most of the day and trying to get you excited about something. Here is a little graph that relates to that. This little graph takes the following mental experiment. Let's line up all teachers in the United States, starting at West 120th Street, and the line goes to probably about someplace in Illinois. And we line them up by quality, and we do the following mental experiment. We know a lot about the impact of teachers along this whole distribution. Think of replacing the bottom 1% of teachers with an average teacher, not a superstar, just an average teacher. Or think about replacing the bottom 2% with an average teacher. What this does is take historical evidence and trace out what that would mean as you go from 2% deselected, 2% who get the zero option, 4, 6, and so forth. Now, one way to put this, and I want you to remember this, is that the difference between us and Canada is that little place up north. It's a bit colder than we are, but in general it has the same culture and everything. They do markedly better in terms of international tests. And Canada is up there. But what this says is that somewhere around, maybe 8% of teachers replaced with an average teacher would get us to the level of Canada. I'm going to tell you what the economic impact of that is in a second. Now, this is actually a very conservative estimate, It says here the low estimate of teacher effectiveness. What low estimate means here is that by some plausible estimates of the variation in teacher quality, the distribution is very narrow. There's not that much difference between the top and the bottom. And this is the bottom end of that range of low. And clearly, it has less impact if you do this policy. If everybody was the same, what would the impact be? Zero. It doesn't have any impact because you replace the average teacher with the average teacher and you get zero. Okay, so the narrower the distribution, the less impact, and that's what this is. But the other plausible end of this range is this blue line, which is that teachers, by a variety of estimates, look wider. This is an upper plausible range. And if you look here, it's, well, maybe 6% of teachers replaced with an average teacher would give you Canada. Now, 6% given 30 teachers in your school, you're talking about 2 teachers. Now, most of us can, in fact, identify, at least as parents, the 2 teachers in the school that we did not want our kids to have. And there's no dispute that those 2 teachers exist. This just says what's the impact of them. By the way, according to the blue line, 10% might get us to Finland, which is everybody's North Star. Let's get up to Finland and so forth by this replacement policy. Now, read this back the other way. Read this back the other way. This says that our average teachers are internationally competitive. This is not an attack on teachers. It says there might be a few that we allow to stay in the classroom that are having a disproportionate impact on the achievement of kids. But in general, we're just replacing with an average teacher. We have a teaching force that is high quality by international standards. Okay, so let's look at the same picture I gave you before. Forget about the first column, which is being Germany, which is 3% of the teachers replaced with an average teacher. But if we got up to being Canada, it's $82 trillion, another 5 times our current GDP. They're in comparable dollar terms. 11%, 11.4% higher GDP over the next 80 years. If you get up to Finland, you're talking about things that just don't even make any sense, right? I mean, we're talking about 7 times or so of GDP from getting to the level of Finland. And we're talking about 30% higher paychecks on average for every worker in the United States over the next 80 years. Okay, so the argument here from the research and the economics is that maybe this problem is important enough that we should take it seriously. So the big picture that I give, yes, I'm almost into your time, Jeff. The common argument that I hear, frankly, is good teachers are essential to improved schools. And everybody makes that argument. Randy Weingarten makes that argument every time I see her. We've got to improve the quality of our teachers and make sure we have high-quality teachers. But then there's always a but. And the but is, you know, it's just so hard to change that maybe we should forget about thinking about anything very different. And what I'm trying to suggest to you is that there are very different economic futures for the United States depending upon whether we take one path or the other. There are very different economic futures that led my colleague down the hall, Condi Rice, wrote a book with somebody that you might remember called Joel Klein, and suggested that our schools were a national security threat. When I first saw this, I thought, this is really hyperbole. Until you realize that other nations in the world are way ahead of us, they're moving very rapidly, and that our power, on top of having crummy foreign policies, our power is being diminished by the fact that we will not be economically viable or as strong as we could be in the future. For Jeff's thing, I was just going to outline, just so you don't think this is all theoretical, look to Washington, D.C., which has in fact instituted a policy that gives big rewards to good teachers. Teachers at the top quintile of the distribution 2 years in a row can get bonuses up to 25% of it, up to $25,000 on their base pay. Teachers in the bottom quintile 2 years in a row get fired. They have now, I skipped the other part. The impact is they've given now in the 4 years of the program about 1,000 bonuses, and there's about 4,000 teachers in Washington, D.C. And they fired 400. There's been research to follow up on this, which Tom D. and Jim Wyckoff have done, which suggests that it's having a true impact. That Washington, D.C., which is a horrible schooling system, has in fact improved faster than any other state over the period this time on NAEP scores in comparisons. So what are the conclusions? It's appropriate to focus on teacher quality, and not because teachers are a cause of our problem. That is not the message. The message is teachers are the solution to our problem, not the cause. There are lots of alternative ways to improve. Vergara versus California is not magic. In fact, nothing has happened because of Vergara versus California except new lawsuits in New York State to keep lawyers busy here and a lot of discussion. But it all depends upon what the legislature, it depends on an appeal, and then it depends upon what the legislature will do as a replacement for the challenged unconstitutional statutes. And obviously they're going to have other alternatives to the current that have been ruled as unconstitutional. And all of this says, I've never been a big fan of courts making school policy. Michael Rebell and I have talked about this a long time. But as Michael said in his 2009 book, he advocated that the courts ought to have a positive and equal role in making policy on important issues. And I've come around to believe, Michael, that your 2009 book, in fact, had a good message in it.
I've read most of the testimony in the Vergara case, and that's a lot, as well as the ruling, which is not a lot. I urge you to read it. The substance of it is about 8 double-spaced pages. You can read it between subway stops on the local train. There's not a lot there, which I think is a very important and interesting factor here. But as I read the testimony and as I read the ruling, I could not find a clear and convincing explanation for how the statutes are the source of the problem that's being addressed, or how eliminating them would change the outcomes for students. And in fact, having studied teachers for over 30 years, I'm concerned that eliminating the statutes, and we don't know what will come next, legislation for sure, but there's no guarantee about what that might be, might unintentionally, one, compromise students' learning opportunities by making the very schools that are the focus of the lawsuit less likely to attract skilled and committed teachers, and that it would, in fact, undermine teachers' prospective teachers' interest in becoming teachers and current teachers' interest in staying. Rather than starting with the statutes, which I took to be Jeff's question when he sent it, I want to begin with the problem and its causes. And I'm going to stick with the school-based issues. That's not to say that poverty, discrimination, inequities of funding don't all play a big role in this. They're very real, but I know more about the schools, and I'll start there. I would say that in the case, there was agreement about the problem, that on average, students in high poverty, high minority schools are more likely to be taught by ineffective and/or unqualified teachers. Where the disagreement comes in, however, is whether the problem is caused by the statutes in question or by other things. And what I want to focus on are dysfunctional work environments and poor management. So the question I think that has to be addressed is, what are students in high poverty, high minority schools, why are they more likely to have ineffective, inexperienced, or poorly qualified teachers? And I would, sorry, you didn't get to see me. I would suggest that a huge piece of this has to do with dysfunctional, mismanaged work environments for the teachers. We know from many research studies that over time, more effective, more experienced, more effective teachers transfer out of high-need schools. Rick, in fact, has done some very important work on that. This is what Richard Ingersoll calls the revolving door. Initially, researchers who studied these patterns inferred that the teachers who transferred out preferred to work with whiter, wealthier student populations. However, recent research shows that it is poor school environments, not the students, that drive the teachers out. In fact, I'm quite sure that the students would also likely leave those dysfunctional schools if that were easy to do. What we have found is that working conditions largely explain this turnover. And I'll give you an example of a study that I was involved in. I conducted it with Matt Kraft and John Pape. We analyzed data from a statewide teacher survey about teachers' working conditions. And we found that, in fact, working conditions matter a great deal to teachers. They're more satisfied and plan to stay longer in schools that have a positive work environment, independent of the school's demographics of students. And although a wide range of conditions matter, those that matter most are not the sort of standard, do we have a good building, how long is the workday? They are the social working conditions, the character and quality of the principal's management and support for teaching and learning, their colleagues' knowledge, skills, and willingness to collaborate, and the quality of the school culture, including its positive focus on learning, respect, order, and discipline across the school. Importantly, positive work environments appear to contribute to students' learning as well. We found that favorable conditions of work predict higher rates of student academic growth when we are comparing schools serving similar demographic groups of students. So we're holding the demographic factors aside. Helen Ladd has found similar relationships, including the improvement in student learning in North Carolina. Notably, sorry, I went too far. Okay. Notably, as I know many of you know, in virtually any large urban school district, you will find some high-performing schools that effectively serve high-poverty, high-minority student populations. Those schools do not lack skilled and committed teachers. In fact, they have few openings, little turnover, and many strong applicants. These schools provide positive work environments. Notably, they operate in the same policy context under the same statutes as the failing schools. A big piece of this issue is that administrators fail to make tenure decisions. And there's a lot of talk about tenure today, and who cares about it, and whether people deserve it, and everybody in New York is willing to back off from saying we are questioning whether teachers should have tenure. That was not the case in California by any means. But the problem is that tenure, there's sort of a prior problem. Tenure is all too often passively awarded because teachers are not evaluated, time passes, and the probationary period is over. For example, the National Council on Teacher Quality conducted an audit of the Boston Public Schools human capital practices in 2010 and found that 1 in 4 schools had not submitted a single teacher evaluation in the prior 2 years. Now, this is 2010, this is not 95. And even though the state law required annual evaluations of non-tenured teachers, in California, administrators have at least 18 months. So depending on who's talking, that's a really long time, a really short time. 18 months is, I would argue, a substantial amount of time, during which they, as administrators, can dismiss a probationary teacher for any reason or no reason without explanation. So all the concern about the procedural review doesn't come in this pre-tenure period. There also is, there's no evidence that I know of, and maybe Rick does, that a longer probationary period leads to better informed tenure decisions or more dismissals. The problem is that principals across the board, and I don't mean every principal for sure, but far too many, simply don't make informed decisions at all before teachers are awarded tenure. So the challenge really is to ensure that those judgments are made, that the teachers are evaluated, supported, and encouraged to leave or are formally sent out the door if they haven't achieved that. The second big piece is that similarly, administrators as a group, and I love principals, this is not about individual principals and how important they are to schools. They are the make or break factor in a school. But for whatever reasons, they fail to evaluate and dismiss ineffective tenure teachers. Now, often the explanation is it won't happen, it's just too hard, it just can't be done. But that's just really not always the case. So many do not regularly evaluate tenured teachers, and all these citations, I have references at the end if anyone cares. However, administrators who do evaluate teachers and document poor performance do succeed in dismissing teachers, or, as has been said earlier, encouraging them to resign. And we don't have a good count of that encouragement, but we know it's a very powerful piece. Even in the Los Angeles school, testimony in the case confirmed that even though the superintendent testified for the plaintiffs, the district had successfully dismissed teachers while John Dacey was superintendent, or those teachers chose to resign. I want to say a couple words about peer assistance and review that some of you may know about. It is a program that is in place in probably at this point about 35 to 40 districts in the United States, so it's not, as widely used as it might be. But there was testimony in the Vergara case from San Juan, California, which is part of Sacramento, about its peer assistance and review program. There are PAR programs in Montgomery County, Maryland, a very high-performing district that has many low-income students, in Cleveland, Ohio, in St. Louis now, in Cincinnati, Poway, California. There are a number of places. In this program, in a PAR program, full-time consulting teachers, these are expert teachers who are selected competitively, are assigned to intensively assist and then eventually to evaluate all novice teachers in the district, though not in California because the law makes that not possible, but most other places it does, and tenured teachers who have been identified by their principals as struggling. Now, it's true, the principal has to have evaluated the person to identify the person for PAR, and that's one of the interesting problems here. A joint labor management PAR panel manages the program, equal numbers or +1 on the teacher side. Consulting teachers report on the performance of those in their caseload to the panel, and then the panel recommends to the superintendent whether individual teachers should be reemployed or dismissed. Because it is a joint labor management initiative, due process is provided throughout, and cases do not end up in arbitration or in the courts. So I think it's possible to design a system that actually is very effective in making these judgments about teacher quality and in making sure that ineffective teachers, or in California, grossly ineffective teachers, which was the lingo of the case, do not remain. About seniority, and I really would like to call it seniority-based layoffs rather than LIFO, because I think that's a little gimmick that's meant to convey that you are there for life, and that's not the case. I would say that seniority is an objective criterion that can be quickly and easily administered in times of budget cuts. Layoffs are meant to be temporary, not a substitute for carefully considered dismissals. And I think that there's been a shift in the since the recession essentially, that people look to layoffs as a process of dismissal rather than as a short-term way of coping. Seniority-based layoffs really align with research findings. On average, teachers improve over time, especially early in their career. Recent research by Ladd and Sorensen shows that teachers continue to improve well beyond the early 4 or 5 year plateau that many people, researchers have identified. And Kraft and Pape have done a terrific study in North Carolina that shows that when teachers work in supportive work environments, they continue to improve to at least year 10, which is the end of their data. So it's a mistake to think that seniority necessarily is protecting weak teachers. What is really important, though, is that if a grossly ineffective teacher is retained, or I would just say an ineffective teacher, because that teacher has not been evaluated and dismissed, then the teacher will remain in the layoff pool. And often, principals encourage ineffective teachers who are in their schools and whom they are not, in my mind, courageous enough to have a tough conversation with and pursue. They will encourage them to transfer to another school in what is colloquially called the dance of the lemons, or pass the trash, or share the wealth. And in fact, this made it into the judge's ruling. I think that's a really serious matter. It's a problem, especially in large school districts. But changing the criterion for layoffs from seniority to some version of performance won't work if the evaluations are not there as evidence of the performance. So what do I think are the likely effects of eliminating the statutes? And I say that because when the word went out from California, it was not, oh, we're going back to the legislature and we're going to talk about 2 years or 3 years. It was, in many newspapers, tenure is over, it's gone. So I think we have to think about how it's playing out other places. I don't expect the ruling to be upheld on appeal, but I didn't expect this ruling either, I guess. But if it is, what might the likely effects of eliminating tenure due process and seniority-based layoffs be? First, I would say there will be no notable effect on administrators' evaluation practices for probationary or tenured teachers. If principals don't evaluate teachers now, the problem of dismissal will remain, and providing even the most basic due process requirements under law would call for some evaluations, some evidence. I would expect little or no improvement in teaching and learning. Swapping out a few teachers will not make a fundamental difference in how students are taught. Schools where principals have high expectations and provide support for professional growth will continue to attract and retain skilled and committed teachers. Whatever student populations those schools serve will benefit from that, whether they're high income, low income, white students, students of color. Others will not. If principals exercise arbitrary authority in the absence of a statute, then effective teachers will leave or avoid their schools. And I'm quite sure that will affect low-income schools more than high-income schools. And as a consequence, the students will feel the substantial negative effects of turnover, which Matt Ronfeld has documented. My fear, as someone who cares about teachers a great deal, is that this decision and subsequent cases will signal to teachers that the society and school districts regard them as short-term workers who are subject to sudden, unexpected, and unwarranted dismissal. And consequently, both current and prospective teachers will come to view teaching as an unsafe and unattractive career. So quickly, to summarize, mismanaged schools and poor work environments, not the statutes, are the primary source of the problem. Administrators currently do not exercise the authority they have to dismiss probationary and tenured teachers. Performance-based layoffs, that's the opposite of LIFO, cannot compensate for poor evaluation and dismissal practices. Eliminating reasonable protections will make teaching less attractive, especially in hard-to-staff schools. And there is no shortcut to creating productive, supportive work environments that attract and retain effective teachers. Thank you.
So I promised to give you each a chance if you wanted to make a short response to the other. Rick, did you?
Yeah, let me just run down quickly. It's amazing how much Susan and I agree on this. A basic problem is the evaluation of teachers. The system has been broken for a long period of time. I think that the teachers' unions have made a horrible strategic mistake by resisting any evaluation of teachers because the opposite is that they get run over in Wisconsin and North Carolina and a variety of other places, and that the teachers should take a place at the table to work on effective evaluations of teachers, and everything depends on that. Somebody mentioned the North Carolina case before, where North Carolina legislature did away with tenure, and this is coming back to the importance of leadership and principles. One of the aspects of that statute was that school systems had to go back and evaluate tenured teachers and make decisions on tenured teachers on whether they were up to the task or not. And there was actually a sort of threshold of how many teachers they had to offer buyout packages to. Two superintendents in North Carolina filed suit against that statute, and their argument was essentially, you know, it's really tough to evaluate teachers, and people don't like me if I evaluate teachers, and so we shouldn't be forced to actually have to evaluate teachers. So part of the problem is that we have, and I didn't emphasize it, and I should have, but Susan made up for that, we have not a very effective set of leadership evaluations, principal evaluations, and programs to run the same policies for principals and as we do for, or as I would like to see for teachers. We disagree a little bit about the evidence on experience. As far as I can see, the evidence after the first 2 or 3 years, there's no average difference between teachers. So average fifth-year teacher is just as effective as the average 25th-year teacher. But the fact that experience improves in the first couple years interacts with this making decisions about tenure, because teachers are just in the business of getting better and learning their craft, and principals have to evaluate whether they're going to get better and be there where at some good point in the future, or just that they're not. And it's a very difficult time to make evaluations. John Dacey, superintendent of LAUSD, did in fact fire 100 teachers under the contract using the provisions of the contract. He has 30,000 teachers, so he got up to 100, and then he just got fired 3 weeks ago. So you know, it's not an easy thing. pretty close to a related issue. And then on LIFO, LIFO, the California statute and a number of other states explicitly do not allow any use of performance evaluations if you have a reduction in force. And Susan's right, it's not going to make up for the bigger issues because it only happens in cases like 2009 where there were cuts in numbers of teachers made because of budgetary things. But if you looked at an analysis done for New York City and you said, let's evaluate a policy where we eliminate 5% of the teachers, and let's look at LIFO, seniority, what is it? Seniority reversed policy? Or what do we call it?
Seniority-based layoffs.
Seniority-based layoffs. If we use seniority-based layoffs versus one based on effectiveness, the policy of laying off 5% of the teachers based on effectiveness and letting class size go up and all that stuff, got an increase in student performance of 0.2 standard deviations. 0.2 standard deviations means if you have an average student and he or she improves by 0.2 standard deviations, she'd move to the 58th percentile of the distribution. It's a noticeable impact on kids using the data for New York City.
So I have I had 7 or 8 things to come to mind while you were speaking, but let me talk about 2.
I only had 2 topics. How could you have 7 or 8 things?
Well, you said more than 2 things. No, I want to say a bit more about the principles piece because I think that one of the problems is that the job is so massive right now, and I would think that this evaluation process would work better if master teachers were involved. And in fact, that's a piece of the impact program in DC as well, to bring in a third eye, as I think Randy Weingarten says. So the other thing is that principals don't necessarily know how to teach. Some do. No, I mean, this is not a secret to anyone who's in a school. Some principals actually have been exemplary teachers. And if I'm a new teacher, I should be able to say to the principal, you want me to do that? Could you model that? Well, when a principal can model it, then the principal is likely to evaluate that teacher regularly, often supervise, provide support. But a lot of principals have jobs requiring them to evaluate teachers, and they really don't know how to teach or how to help people get better. Those who do are extraordinary, and I think some of the new evaluation processes and the training will help people get better at it. But the other thing is, even if you're a really good teacher, you become an administrator, if you're in a high school, if you're in a middle school where you haven't actually studied or taught a certain subject, then you might not be the best person to advise or evaluate a teacher. And so I think we need to broaden. The principal who doesn't know how to teach math, that principal has plenty to do. And the important thing is to bring in someone else in this process who can do that kind of peer evaluation, support, and assessment. The other thing I would say is I have problems with thought experiments, I guess, in the whole analysis of what if in New York City we replace this person with, no, it's not this person, a person who is at this level with a person who is at that level. Because the reality of schools in districts is just so much, they're real people, they're real places. When I was a doctoral student, the first study I ever did was about what we called then merit-based layoffs. It was the last big period of layoffs before what we have right now in the mid-'80s. And I studied contracts that allowed districts to have any kind of criteria. It didn't even have to include seniority, though they all had that in there as one. And they had, needs of the system, contribution to the school, a variety of things. So I wanted to identify districts where I could find out, I was very optimistic about this. How does this work? I can write something that will help districts know how to do it. And in the end, it was really only a small number of districts that were actually using the contract language that they had. So I went to them and I interviewed principals and central office people, and not teachers at that point, but just trying to find out. And in fact, out of, I think, 6 districts, only one, however many, it was only one, had used the language to lay off a teacher, because the principals themselves didn't want to have to rank order the teachers in their schools, but because they count on teachers for different things. The one district that laid off a teacher because of performance had to recall that teacher when the funding came back. And so, you know, schools are complicated places. They're not all just rankings of teachers by effectiveness. They do different things. They get called on for different things. So I think proposals have to be advanced in the context of the way that schools and districts work or might work.
So, one of the things that I'm always interested in, I don't know whether people in the audience here see it the same way, but you sort of can get a feeling, even in the first panel, that boy, if the 2 lawyers went off in a room by themselves, maybe they'd come up with a solution. They seem to agree on a lot of things. You both have said, you know, that there's a lot that you agree on.
Oh, if we were the lawyers.
Now, so in the legal context, it's structured as adversarial. In the end, there is a plaintiff and there is a defendant. But in the research world, there doesn't have to be an adversarial relationship. So I just have a couple of questions about what it's like as researchers and social scientists operating in an institutional venue in which there is this adversarial setup. And I wonder if you could just very briefly sort of say how you've gotten involved in testifying in courts, and then I'll ask you what that's like.
Okay. You've done more than I have. I have one case to speak about only, so.
As Professor Rebel knows, I've been involved in a large number of school finance cases, including the small cities school finance case that's currently going on in New York State right now. I got involved in this work because I realized fairly early on that the courts were making large numbers of substantive decisions about the operations of schools, and that if you were interested in school policy, you had to be interested in the decisions that the courts were making, because they were altering and continue to alter the course of U.S. education. So I have been involved. The work I've done in the past turns out to be conveniently placed for many defense attorneys who want to have me testify on my studies about funding of schools and the impact on students, and more recently in Vergara, which is an oddball case in terms of the long history about the impact of teacher effectiveness. So I have testified in 20 school finance cases and a few other ancillary cases. I find that the courtrooms are pretty bad places for presenting social science evidence, because the rules of the court on what is evidence differ dramatically from the rules of social science on what is evidence and how to interpret it. And so it is frequently a bit of a trial to, frustrating trial. If you were sitting in Los Angeles Superior Court with Judge Rolf True, and the lawyer for the other side said, have you studied the effect of experience on achievement? And a researcher might naturally say, yes, and you find that the first couple years, and you get about that far before Judge Rolf True says, that's a yes or no question. And it stops there. And so there are parts of this that are, different tribes have different mores, and in this place the lawyer's tribe has the rules.
I was really naive. I went into this case because it was about something I had cared a lot about and had been working on for years, and thought I actually had a contribution to make. My grandchildren, 2 of them live in California. My son-in-law is a teacher in California. My daughter's been a teacher in California. And I care about the fact that it's way down on the PISA scale. So I thought this idea of eliminating these statutes without really understanding how schools work and what teachers care about is a pretty serious matter. But I really experienced what Rick is saying, that I'll give an example. I had a 7-hour deposition before the trial. They came to Boston, and it was, by contrast, informal compared to the trial, because the lawyers on both sides are there, but they allow you to do more than say yes or no. You actually can explain something, or if the one lawyer doesn't let you, they make it possible very quickly. So what the plaintiff's lawyers had done was get publications of mine, all kinds of publications, not the research piece, but often the sort of commentary piece, or it was just this random selection in my view. And I was asked in one question, had I written that administrators rarely pursue dismissals because they take too long and are unsuccessful or something. And I said, well, I probably did. I've written a lot of sentences, and I'm not quite sure where that one is. So he showed me in an article that John Pape and I wrote about the cost-benefit of PAR programs, that in the setup for the piece, I had that sentence. And the whole point of the whole article was, however. And I was able to explain that in the deposition. But when I got in court, it came up again. And it was in the end, the last hour of the trial, I answered probably 50 questions of the version. Am I correct, Professor Johnson, that you have never dismissed a tenured teacher in California? And so it went on and on. In California, you've not studied this in California, you've not studied that in California. And that was painful. I had a migraine at the same time, so it was particularly painful. But one of the things they showed me was, in that last section, was that line. And had I written it, and there was no chance for explanation. But the lawyer for the defendants came back on redirect and allowed me to explain it. In the ruling, the judge has built the ruling drawing on several things that the witnesses for the defendants said during the case. And mine is that I had said that it was very hard to dismiss teachers, and then it said in California, and that my research, substantiated that. And that's just that was the way it felt the whole way, that they didn't really care what you learned or thought or could suggest or how you could recommend what might be done.
One of the things that came out in the morning panel is the lawyer on the side of the plaintiffs in the Wright case, accepted the challenge. I think I heard this, that they had to establish a causal link between the particular statutes and the outcomes that they were interested in. And very briefly, I wonder if you could each say something about how, as a social scientist, you think about causality and how you think the courts are likely to wrestle with that question of causal links.
Quickly, I just think the causality piece, if you take it seriously and you bring a bunch of researchers, you can't make a case. I mean, the causal part of it, and the idea that you would start with twins is, you bring social scientists in and they'll tell you all the things that Richard said about the problem with twins. So I think it's never going to be totally convincing, but there has to be something between this point and that point.
So I think the question is, what is the causality that you're looking at? There is no evidence any place that I know of that the statute that has 2 years to tenure causes bad teachers. On the other hand, there is, I think, plausible case can be made that having that statute causes principals and superintendents to not come back if there's a mistake been made and to try to fix a mistake by getting rid of a bad teacher. So yeah, I think you can say that it causes them to behave differently and not make management decisions that they should be making. And they might have, yes, better made the decision a year earlier, or 3 years earlier, or 5 years earlier. But all the evidence suggests that in any school district, that in any state that we've ever looked at, there are a number of grossly ineffective teachers. That's what that is. Not a large number, but there are a number that are around there. And to the extent that these statutes prevent taking action once somebody wants to take that action, I think you can establish causality there. Causality in all these cases is generally ignored. I mean, that's the history of the school finance cases. Nobody can show that lack of funding caused these kids to be low achieving. In fact, the plaintiffs in the school finance cases usually argue the opposite. Low achievement is caused by poverty. Therefore, you ought to give us more money. And it just completely ignoring causation. And that's never an issue.
So I do want to open up the questions. If people who have questions could line up at the mics, I'll just ask one question while you're getting up there for a final question for each of you, which is, are there important and relevant questions about which you wish we could have more and better research that would illuminate this decision? What are the important open research questions in your mind?
Hundreds. There are hundreds. Researchers need to do more work. On this, leaving aside the legality, we don't know what the impact of different kinds of evaluation systems will ultimately be, because they depend upon the rules and who's doing it and so forth. I like the Washington, D.C. rules because, just as Susan pointed out, they involve principal decisions, but they have trained outside professional evaluators going in multiple times, visiting classrooms, and making multiple evaluations. And any value-added or test score information plays a pretty minor role. But we don't know a lot about these evaluation systems and their long-run impact and different kinds of evaluation systems. That'd be one at the top of my list.
There are tons of them, but I think one that came to mind today is, why don't we know about the dismissal practices in states with different numbers of years to tenure? I mean, that whole case was discussed about 2 years and 3 years, and I'm not at all convinced that it matters. And we don't have any information on that. So,
great. So we have a question I want to ask that you model the kinds of questions we want, which is say who you are and ask a question relatively succinctly.
Sure. My name is Maria Guo. I'm a second-year master's student here in EPSA. I was particularly fascinated by your discussions on the use of social science evidence and the courts. And so I've taken classes here with Professor Rebel and Professor Hoover, and from my recollection, it seems like a lot of times, social sciences evidence are used to the advantage in similar court cases, and particularly in the Brown case, in the Brown 1 case where footnote 11 was, the use of social science evidence played a relatively significant role in the decision. So I guess, could you elaborate more on your perspective on that? And then so could you sort of respond to that? Thank you.
Footnote 11 was a horrible footnote. It was bad at social science evidence, even though it was relevant. The courts are particularly ill-equipped to judge the quality of evidence. Therefore, you get people, dueling statements of people and maybe supported by how glib they are in answering questions, or maybe supported by the length of their CV or something. But the courts are really not very well equipped to deal with issues of social science evidence and to judge the quality of it. And so it's a proverbial crapshoot.
Can I also add that I think to the extent that, and I'm not speaking with any particular knowledge about court decisions, but to the extent that social science evidence is important, numbers are more important than qualitative research. And I think that's a serious problem when you're working with such complex organizations and trying to figure out how to make a difference. So, you know, I don't have in my work the percentages that I know might be influential. And so I constantly am trying to figure out how do I explain the complexity of this so that a judge who actually was more influenced by Roz Chetty's numbers than I think almost anything else in the case, as far as I can tell.
They're good numbers.
Well, but they're not about the statutes. I mean, they weren't about
Well,
California.
none of these cases are really about the statutes in some fundamental sense.
No, as I say,
the
I'm
courts
naive.
in line with Michael's plea in his 2009 book are trying to help fix the schools. They realize there's a problem there. They want to do their part, and that's what these cases are all about.
Yeah, Michael.
I feel compelled to just make a comment about the references to use of social science evidence in the courts, especially since I teach a course on that, and Maria was one of my students there. One thing that bothers me about the way this issue has come up here is that it's very isolated. There's no comparative institutional perspective. Yes, there are all these dangers, there are all these potential distortions in the way courts use social science evidence. A good lawyer, like your lawyer on redirect, can come back and try to get a more balanced record. But the real question for me is, what are the alternative decision-making mechanisms in other branches of government, in other places where decisions are made? And when you look at the issue that way, there are a lot of drawbacks to the way legislatures make decisions on policy, how they use social science evidence, a lot of drawbacks the way the executive branches do. We don't have time to get into all of this, but I just wanted to remind people in the audience that we've got to see this in a much fuller perspective.
Could I just say that I think I don't have an answer for this, but I think it's worth understanding whether courts are better on some issues than others within education. And I think this one seemed to be not one that matched.
Well, maybe I can take a crack and ask whether it was a problem of some of the evidence that was available. The thing that impressed me in reading that decision is you have this number, which, as you said, clearly affected the judge, of how many thousands of kids there are with an quote-unquote ineffective teacher. But I didn't see, in his opinion, and it may have been because I didn't go back and read the transcripts, any question about what evidence there was that tried, maybe this is your causation thing again, how many fewer there would have been if you had changed the process, if you had a different tenure length of time. And is that because there just hasn't been any real examination in the social science field as to how these management decisions, as you're describing them, actually affect the outcomes on students? And maybe the problem is we really haven't looked enough at the outcome problem in the research, but that's a question. Is there enough information for anybody to really use for this purpose?
I think there was a lot more information. I think the testimony on both sides provided very rich information. It was necessarily incomplete, but I think don't just read the ruling, because it really doesn't reflect a lot of information, research, personal experience. I mean, it went on for a couple months, and it, you know, there are limitations to what was presented that were imposed by the structure of the process, and then the judge's ruling, to my mind, just disregarded most of what happened, so, and what was presented.
You might recognize that we were on different sides of this issue. I thought the judge was very clear in his 16 pages. It probably wouldn't have provoked the same amount of discussion and consideration had he given the 300-page nuanced version of it, but maybe it would have.
Do you think that it was really 8 pages because the rest of it was kind of procedure and prior cases and all, but do you think
That's lawyers.
in that decision, do you think that he explained how the statutes caused the problem?
No, that's what I'm coming back to my response to Jeff. I don't know, nobody knows that, and it's not really a researchable question, frankly, because there is such limited variation across states, and to analyze this question, you would have to be able to pull out the separate impact of a year difference or 2 years difference in tenure decisions when Mississippi really differs a lot, not only from New York State, but from Louisiana. To analyze that, to research that would be very difficult. But my answer is that that's, in some sense, not the causation that's relevant. The causation is relevant is, are you causing people not to make management decisions after discovering that a teacher is ineffective? And that's the key issue of causation, if you want to put it in those terms, that I'm concerned about. And there was substantial testimony from superintendents who said, you know, what do you make of it? They said, sure, I'd rather do a better job, you know, and that's the testimony you're getting. But it's plausible that, in fact, a number of superintendents, including John Dacey, would, in fact, make better decisions if it didn't, on average in California, cost something on the order of $450,000 per tenured, fully contested tenure case, dismissal case, and they're 50% likely to succeed. So you're talking about very large numbers, and you don't do it lightly, and you don't do it very often.
So we have one last question.
My name's Matt Barnum. I work for an organization called Educators for Excellence. My question's for Professor Hanushek. I'm wondering what you make of the argument that job security and tenure is an important form of compensation for teachers, and that if we reduce job security, we may make it easier and get gains from dismissing the lowest performing teacher, but we might also make it harder to attract average or above average teachers because their effective compensation is lower because they're more afraid of being dismissed.
Most economists, including myself, would say that if you make the job riskier, you have to pay for it. And so that you would have to increase salaries to some extent to pay for the fact that there were higher risks. The current situation is that half the teachers leave teaching by the end of 5 years, that I think is independent of job security. They just don't find the job attractive or whatever. I would personally rather pay good teachers a lot more, to keep good teachers around. But the problem with these blunt instruments is that paying all teachers more attracts both good and bad teachers. There's an economic theorem that bad teachers like more money as much as good teachers. And so just paying more money to all teachers means, yes, you'll keep these effective teachers, but you also tend to keep ineffective teachers at the same time. And so it's more a matter of getting the whole system readjusted as opposed to, yes, there's full risk bearing by the firm or not. 80% of workers in the US economy are in jobs that have nothing like the tenure of teachers, but you could argue that they do have tenure, because no firm is going to randomly dismiss workers. It costs too much. And to arbitrarily, with no process, say that this is a very risky job, no firm does that, because that's not good management. And I would expect that you could get schools to a point where they operated a little bit more like industry, and so that I guess that makes me, in the vernacular of anti-reform, that I'm a privatizer. But I think that there are lessons we can learn from the way all industries operate and what has made the U.S. the most powerful nation in the world.
Can I respond to that question of being risk averse? It comes up as the economists have been writing about this issue, and an exchange in the cauldron of positions about what effect this would have. I don't think that good teachers would be worried so much about losing their jobs. I think they would worry about working in schools where they were sort of really unclear about what could happen, and whether if they were evaluated, would it be by some, on the basis of some practice that was inappropriate. So I think it's not I'm scared, but why should I bother to, kill myself in your school if it's not clear to me that you even observe what I do and assess my work? So I think it's a different kind of risk. It's not like joining the military and going to Syria. It's about, is this what I want to devote my life to? I care about the kids, I care about the teachers, but the school is actually not a place I want to be in.
But that's why you need an effective and reliable evaluation system. Not a perfect one. Nobody has a perfect evaluation system, but you need a reliable one that's trustworthy. And
I agree.
DC, I think, is an example of that, where you have a very clear evaluation system. They revise it regularly, they look at the data, and it seems to operate. At the same time, the AFT fought to the death to prevent this from being used, and that's, I think, was to their detriment.
So I'm going to ask you in a second to thank the panelists. Just a quick note on sort of an advertisement for what happens next. There's a reception just down the hall from 5:30 to 6, and then we'll be reconvening at 6. We'll have a short conversation with Mona Davids, the plaintiff on the other suit besides the right suit, which got much of the attention this morning. And then we'll have a panel that deals seriously with the question of when are courts the right venue to work with, including including differences in terms of whether you'll see that the panelists play out in different positions on whether it's right for the courts to deal with equity issues and not right to deal with tenure kinds of issues, or it's wrong for them to deal with both kinds. And it's going to be amazing to see, and if you come, this is my pitch, you'll understand why it's interesting to watch Rick applaud Michael's argument in his book and how Michael's going to complicate that argument. So we'll see you all.
He's going to deny what he said in 2009, I predict.
So let's have a round of applause for the panel.